Hello and welcome back to this channel. So the previous video, the sour bread versus sourdough, got quite a lot of traction and we got a lot of questions and comments. So I highly encourage you, for the context of this video, to please watch the previous one. I've posted the link in the bottom bar below just to give you a little bit more background, since I will be referring to it quite often throughout this presentation. Baking soda and baking powder. What was Ellen G. White's real message? The reason why we decided to go with this topic is because I got a lot of requests for it. There are a few more, but this one definitely got more requests than others since we were talking about bread. So let's go ahead and dive right in because we have a lot of content to go through. Okay, for the non-Adventists that are present or viewing, I wanted to give you a little bit of a recap of who Ellen G. White is. Ellen G. White is the most translated female nonfiction author in the history of literature. I know, look it up. She's also one of the founding figures of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She played a pivotal role in establishment of what is now Loma Linda University Medical Center. That's where I went to school, and taught that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Her writings emphasized wholeness, linking physical health, mental clarity, and spiritual vitality as inseparable. So who am I? My name is Dr. Kazzi. I'm a registered dietitian with a BS and a master's in nutrition and dietetics. I have a PhD in rehabilitation science. I'm a cookbook author. I'm in clinical and private practice. I'm the mother to Joseph and Amaya. I'm wife to Lucas, and I'm a practicing Adventist. First of all, a very important disclaimer. The information being provided here is intended for you to utilize your own judgment on this matter. I am not telling anyone what to do or what to believe. The purpose of this presentation is to lay out the known data on this topic, which up until now has not been thoroughly addressed by a nutritional expert in the Adventist community. Okay, introduction. The objective of this presentation is to clear the confusion regarding Mrs. White's comments on leavening agents, specifically baking soda and baking powder, and to provide practical guidance based on food science, clinical research, and healthful baking practices. The context: many Adventists are uncertain about whether baking soda and baking powder are harmful based on Mrs. White's writings. But the issue here lies more in their misuse than the ingredients themselves, which is similar to what we saw with the sour bread versus sourdough video, which again, I encourage you guys to see. Here's a quick outline. We're going to look at some quotes from Mrs. White. We're going to clarify some terms, which I think is very important right now. We're going to look at the historical perspective because I think that's so important. Most of all of these statements were said around 150 years ago. That needs to be put in perspective. We're going to look at the leavening agents and their characteristics, the usage and health risks, analysis, and finally the conclusion. Okay, let's first start by looking at some of Mrs. White's quotes. I chose 3 that I thought best embodied the gist of what she was saying on this topic. Some do not feel that it is their religious duty to prepare food properly, hence they do not try to learn how. They let their bread sour before baking, and then the saleratus, we talked about that in the previous video. It's essentially a precursor to sodium bicarbonate to remedy a cook's carelessness, and it makes it totally unfit for the human stomach, and we'll talk about the chemistry shortly. In my travels, I see entire families suffering with sickness in consequence of poor cooking. Sweet, nice, healthful bread is seldom seen upon their tables. Yellow saleratus biscuits. Now, yellow is the color that a food item, a baked good, would become when too much of an alkaline ingredient, too much of a base ingredient was added without a neutralizing effect of an acid. And normally we don't have acids added to bread. It's usually water, flour, and either some sort of rising agent. So this bread would turn yellow, meaning there was way too much of a basic ingredient that was added. And this resulted in heavy, clammy bread and the breaking down of the digestive organs of tens of thousands, which makes sense. It's essentially poisonous bread. The use of soda or baking powder in bread making is harmful and unnecessary. Soda causes inflammation of the stomach and often poisons the entire system. Yes, if there's no neutralizing effect with an addition of a properly dosed acid, it can definitely do that. Many housewives think that they cannot make good bread without soda. In modern culinary practices, we never add baking soda to bread. We usually use a version of a yeast. So many housewives think that they cannot make good bread without the soda, but this is an error. If they would take the trouble to learn better methods, or maybe ancient methods, their bread would be more wholesome, and to a natural taste, it would be more palatable. So as you can see, the baking soda is being used in the context of poor skill or poor culinary practices. I really want to take a moment to break down the terms. So saleratus, which was used in the 1830s, this was an earlier version of baking soda, essentially potassium bicarbonate, and it was used before sodium bicarbonate and was used before sodium bicarbonate became industrially available. And then in 1846, we have soda. So sodium bicarbonate enters the scene as an alkaline substance that requires an acid to activate it. It needs to be added when there's the presence of buttermilk, lemon juice, or vinegar, or some sort of acid. Now, baking powder is very interesting, and that combines the basic ingredient, which is the sodium bicarbonate, with an acidifying agent such as cream of tartar, which is a byproduct of the winemaking industry. It's not alcoholic, it's just a byproduct, it's just an acid. It's a more naturally occurring acid. And a stabilizer was often added to the baking powder in order to prevent the acid and the base from reacting prematurely. So, baking powder did not require an external acid like vinegar or buttermilk to activate it. It activated on its own as soon as it came in contact with an aqueous solution. Both of these were used to create carbon dioxide, which causes the dough and the batter to rise, resulting in lighter, fluffier baked goods. So I want us to really understand what baking powder is because that's essentially what we use today. It is baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, combined with an acid such as monocalcium phosphate or the cream of tartar, and the starch, which is a glucose polymer. The ratio of this is usually 2 to 1, 2 parts acid to 1 part baking soda. That's the proper portion to neutralize the effect. It produces the carbon dioxide, and then the two items, the baking soda and the acid, neutralize each other. They cross each other out. Again, we have the base and the acid in properly dosed amounts. That's the effect of it. Now for some historical perspective. We really need to understand the environment and the conditions of the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. Like we are talking no Food Network, no Google. Individuals at that time had very limited resources. They didn't have proper measuring cups or spoons. That didn't enter the scene until the 1900s. So when it came to cooking, there was limited resources and there were limited tools. Measuring cups and spoons as standardized tools for cooking became popular in the late 1900s, but did not exist before that. So people were using teacups and large spoonfuls and handfuls as guides. And you can't do that when it comes to baking, especially when it involves the uses of acids and bases that are poorly measured or not properly measured. And this is probably what a modern kitchen might have looked like in Ellen White's time. So basically you have the stoves, pots and pans, tins and bowls. Let's take a quick look at the inventors of baking powder. So we have Alfred Bird in 1843. He's a British chemist, and he created a mixture of the sodium bicarbonate and the tartaric acid or cream of tartar that acted as a chemical leavening agent. And he developed it because his wife had allergies to yeast and eggs. I thought that's quite adorable that he would do that for her. And then we have Eben Norton Horsford in 1856. Now, he's a Harvard-trained American chemist, and he developed a more modern baking powder using calcium acid phosphate instead of the cream of tartar, which was more readily available and it was easier to manufacture. Now, the cream of tartar, though, I will say, is more naturally occurring, but most modern baking powders that you get, the baking powder jars, those are going to have the calcium acid phosphate. Now, he patented his invention and established the Rumford Chemical Works to produce and market it. So here we have a picture of what that might have looked like. So these are the inventors of baking powder, and I wanted to note this. So Eben, who's our American biochemist, in 1856, he patented his product. Ellen G. White lived from 1827 to 1915. Her vision on health reform was around 1863, which is just around the time when most likely the baking powder and the baking sodas were more heavily in use based on these inventions that we're seeing. So let's break down the terms, the chemical composition, and find the modern equivalents. So saleratus basically was no longer used as soon as baking soda came on the scene. And so it's typically potassium bicarbonate or later sodium bicarbonate. That was roughly a baking soda in a modern equivalent. Okay, so if you just added saleratus to a flour mixture, without any type of acid to neutralize it in hoping that it would fluff up or do something, essentially you were doing it incorrectly and you were creating a poisonous food. Why? Because A, you weren't measuring how much of this basic product was going in. You didn't have a neutralizing component. And finally, if you don't have that, then that's probably resulting in it turning yellow. And if you still consume it because of ignorance, of course you're going to get sick. Now, baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, and the modern equivalent is baking soda that we have today. Most of you probably have it under a sink or in a garage. Now, baking powder, again, sodium bicarbonate plus an acid and some starch. This is a distinct product, especially if it's measured correctly and if it's properly regulated. It's basically going to just neutralize itself out once it's added to a recipe. Okay, now we're going to look into the leavening characteristics. Because saleratus wasn't going to be as used as much, we're just going to focus on baking soda and baking powder. The composition, baking soda, again, sodium bicarbonate. The composition of baking powder, sodium bicarbonate, which is the base, plus an acid, the cream of tartar, with some starch to prevent early activation. Let's look at pH disruption. For baking soda, can neutralize the stomach acid, potentially raising the pH, affecting digestion. If there's too much baking soda and not an accompanying acid of some sort, then you are going to have definitely stomach pain and imbalance of your pH, which can affect your blood and will have negative consequences, most definitely. And there's the source. For the baking powder, it's less likely to disrupt the pH, even if you use larger amounts of it. Why? Because it contains both an acid and the base, the alkaline component. They neutralize each other if it's a properly regulated product. And we again can see the source there from Food Chemistry 7th edition. So now, what are the gastrointestinal distress type symptoms that you can experience? We'll have bloating, belching, flatulence, potential for delayed gastric emptying, and discomfort if overused. If baking soda is overused without an accompanying acid, these are the conditions we can experience. For the baking powder, you can experience gas, bloating, and discomfort, but it's milder than the baking soda due to the acid-base balance. Again, source, Clinical Nutrition Journal 2016. And what we're seeing here is more of a misuse of these ingredients resulting in these sort of conditions. Okay, so this is probably the most important slide in the entire presentation. Usage amount and health risks. Characteristics for baking soda and baking powder. The amount that may cause distress per serving. So one slice of, for example, one slice of banana bread. If you had within one slice of banana bread, 1 to 1.5 teaspoons in the one slice, meaning you would have probably had, if it's a 9-inch tray and each slice is about an inch or so, you would have had like 8 slices in that one tray. That would have been somewhere around like 8 to 10 teaspoons. Nobody does that. And that's the amount that would cause damage if there was 1 to 1.5 per slice. So the whole thing would have required at least a few tablespoons. Now, baking powder, you'd need 2 to 3 teaspoons per slice, remember, because the baking powder contains both an acid and a base, so you'd need more of that because it's going to neutralize. But still, 2 to 3 teaspoons could cause some distress if it's concentrated in that one little slice. But that would have meant that you would probably need to put 12 teaspoons in an entire loaf in order to get a negative effect, and people just don't do that right now. Other health risks that can result from overusing these ingredients, excessive sodium leading to electrolyte imbalances. We talked about this in the previous presentation, alkalosis and fluid retention, and extreme overuse. Now, in baking powder, you will still get mild discomfort, but no significant health risks unless extremely excessive. So you probably would need to use like 1/4 to 1/2 cup in one loaf to really have issues with the baking powder. So this is the most important part, the safe amount per slice, meaning the amount that's not going to cause any distress because it's negligible. In terms of the baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon to 1 teaspoon in an entire loaf. And you'd add that to, for example, 2 teaspoons of lemon juice. Not that you would put that in banana bread, but you get the point. And in terms of the baking powder, the amount that's safe per recipe, meaning for the entire 9-inch loaf, is the 1 to 2 teaspoons that we see in most recipes. Most culinary baking recipes are going to recommend 1 to 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Some of these baking powders are double acting, meaning it's going to activate once you add the fluid. It's going to activate in the aqueous solution and it's going to react, cause some bubbles, it's going to rise a little bit, and then it's going to activate again in the oven once it's exposed to heat. The issue is having too much in one slice. That's when we're going to have some problems. So as a baker myself, I never use baking soda, to be honest. I only use baking powder, and I prefer to get a baking powder that does not contain aluminum, and it will say that on the container. And so the 1 to 2 teaspoons is very consistent with how I've baked, and no issues result from that. Okay, so some context. While Mrs. White was cautious about certain ingredients, her concerns were largely about the misuse of leavening agents, especially in large quantities or when not balanced properly with other ingredients. Again, this is the issue of concern. The key message: the issue isn't with baking soda and baking powder themselves, but rather how much is used and whether the recipes were balanced. And in a lot of cases, women were utilizing the baking powder or baking soda that they had to fix dough that had already spoiled. And that's just not a correct way of managing these ingredients. Some other points to consider. The baking powder of today has definitely changed and is no longer the same as the baking powder that we had back then. And then we're going to look at individual sensitivities and how they can vary. And then the philosophical principle of purity and simplicity. I think this is really important to touch on. Finally, the modern digestive context. Number one, baking powder today is not like the baking powder back then. So some characteristics of modern baking powder is that it's highly purified. It wasn't highly purified back in Ellen G. White's time. It's carefully balanced in acid-base ratios in order to properly react, and it's often double acting with part of the carbon dioxide released during mixing and the rest during baking. It's measured with standard teaspoons and it's used in well-tested ratios. So it's usually 1 teaspoon per 1 cup of flour. That's the typical recommendation. So the result is minimal residue, no leftover sodium bicarbonate to actually irritate the stomach. So 19th century baking powder formulations were unregulated, sometimes adulterated with aluminum, limestone, and impure acids. The ratios were still poorly understood and the powder could degrade over time. Cooks often just guessed measurements, spoonfuls varied, and recipes lacked scientific backing. So while 1 teaspoon of modern baking powder in a loaf today is harmless, a heaping spoon of unstable powder in a small batch of, let's say, the biscuits, back then could result in residual alkali or too much base, leading to irritation. Number two, individual sensitivity can vary. Mrs. White likely observed people with poor digestion or gut sensitivity reacting to chemically leavened foods. Repeated reports of discomfort from hot breads and biscuits made hastily with the saleratus or the soda, which, by the way, we should wait till the baked good has completely cooled off before we eat it because it's still releasing carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide could also cause discomfort. Today, some individuals with functional dyspepsia or IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, or low stomach acid might still feel bloated or off after a chemically leavened product, but the average person does not experience this. Now, number three, the philosophical principle of purity and simplicity. This is also very key. Mrs. White's writings consistently reflects a first do no harm, especially to your own body approach, and a strong bias towards wholesome, unprocessed ingredients. And this is clearly reflected throughout her writings. To her, the issue wasn't just, does this give you a stomachache today? It's more of, is this food pure? Is this food natural? Is it optimal for long-term physical and spiritual health? That's the big picture. So even if a slice of cake doesn't give you pain, she still might say it's not the best fuel for your body. It's part of a broader culture of indulgent or artificial foods, and it encouraged shortcuts rather than learning the better methods of food preparation, like using high quality wild yeast or fermentation to create your bread. Number four, modern digestive health context. While most people don't experience acute gastrointestinal issues from small amounts of baking powder, the cumulative effect of processed foods, which again, this is the main issue, poor gut health and low microbial diversity does manifest in today's health epidemics. It's multifactorial. It's definitely not isolated to one thing. You can have zero baking powder and still live on junk food. Mrs. White's intuition and inspiration was more towards steering people towards naturally prepared foods, which is remarkably in line with current microbiome science. Now for the recap. Small amounts of modern baking powder are well tolerated by most people today, again, because of the regulated neutralizing characteristics. But in Mrs. White's time, products were unstable, doses were inconsistent, sensitivities were visible, and her standard was not just comfort, but wholeness and reform. She wasn't reacting to a 1-inch slice of today's banana bread. She was prescribing a lifestyle, not just avoiding symptoms, but embracing purity, discipline, and optimal nourishment. That is the big picture. So the question of baking soda and baking powder is more of the poison is in the dose kind of case. Anything in improper dosage is going to be harmful. Even if you drink too much water, you could develop kidney problems. Moderation and proper dosing is key. So here's the summary on the matter. Mrs. White's caution against baking soda reflected the limited culinary science of her time and a concern for potential misusing of ingredients. Today, we understand that small, precise amounts from regulated sources are safe, allowing us to honor her wisdom while applying modern knowledge. So, does the evidence show us that it's safe to use baking powder for baked goods in recommended amounts and on occasion? To me, it's pretty clear, but I'll let you guys answer that for yourselves. And the last question, should Seventh-day Adventists be concerned about having baking powder in moderation occasionally in the context of a nutrient-dense and balanced diet? To me, it's pretty clear, but I'll let you guys answer that for yourselves. I wanted to leave you guys with a fun little tip. You can make your own baking powder if you prefer to use cream of tartar. Instead of the typical baking powder, we'll have just an industrial version of an acid, but cream of tartar is just a little bit cleaner. So overall, this is a simple recipe. It's 1 part baking soda to 2 parts cream of tartar, and then 1 part of cornstarch, which is optional. And you mix that up. You have a small quantity of it. That way you have a cleaner version of a baking powder. It's not to say that the baking powders you get from the store are bad. I would just highly recommend if you do get them, just make sure it's aluminum free, and usually they'll have that on the label. And that's all. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this information beneficial. If you did, please feel free to share it. Also, go ahead and like this video. You can also subscribe so that you can be the first to know about new content that's released. And also, I'm going to go ahead and link here on the screen the sour bread versus sourdough video so that you can watch that to get more context on this topic. There are more topics coming. Please feel free to go ahead and post your questions and comments in the comment section, and I'll be sure to have a look at them. Thank you all so much for watching and have a wonderful day.